Hello everyone, it's Ashwin Rao. Today's video brings you a feature on a legendary lens that remains relevant to modern 35mm rangefinder photography. This is a lens that dates back to its origins in the 1950s and was only produced for about 15 years during that era. This lens is incredibly rare, hard to find particularly in the Leica Thread Mount, which is adaptable to the M mount, but it's a lens that's sought after based off of its unique history, its beautiful rendering for both color and black and white work, and its unique optical design, all of which make this one of the most sought after and collectible lenses in rangefinder photography. This is the Nippon Kogaku 3.5cm f1.8 Leica Thread Mount lens. This lens is a rangefinder coupled lens. And sure, there are modern 35mm lenses that will outperform this lens in terms of corner sharpness, color performance, and rendering. But what you get with the W-Nikkor is a rare fusion of a classic lens that performs incredibly uniquely, beautiful tonality for both color and black and white work, as well as being relevant today as a lens with an incredible amount of character at the 35mm focal length. The W-Nikkor is such a unique lens that I think it's worth spending some time discussing its optical properties, its rendering, as well as its history. I'm excited to share my knowledge with you. I'm going to share a number of resources that are available online, which allowed me to learn a lot more about this lens and appreciate it even more for what it is as an optical and historical masterpiece. Let's get into the history of the W-Nikkor 3.5cm f1.8 because it is particularly interesting and well worth discussing for any of you who are enthusiastic about the history of rangefinder cameras and lenses. Well, the W-Nikkor 3.5cm f1.8 holds the distinction of being the very first super speed wide-angle lens produced in the 1950s. It had a production run from 1956 to 1965, and it in fact beat out Leica's own efforts to produce a super speed wide-angle lens by at least 5 years when Leica subsequently released the 35mm f1.4 Summilux preaspherical lens that holds a place amongst many vintage lens enthusiasts and rangefinder photographers. On top of that, the W-Nikkor was produced in extremely limited quantities in the Leica Thread Mount, and in fact only 1,500 copies of this lens were ever made, lending itself further to its rarity and desirability amongst lens collectors of Leica rangefinder and Leica Thread Mount or Nikon rangefinder enthusiasts. In the Nikon S mount, this lens was available a little bit more broadly with 7,000 copies made, and in fact, Nikon actually re-released the same optical design in 2005 to commemorate their special edition release of the Nikon SP rangefinder camera. That was Nikon's last ever rangefinder film camera made. The lens is remarkable for being extremely sharp with minimal to no distortion, and really because of its rarity in Leica Thread Mount, which is easily adaptable to the M mount, as well as unique properties and history regarding its design and optical qualities, it becomes one of the most sought after and rare lenses on the market today. The lens design should be credited to Hideo Azuma, who was one of Nikon's most prolific and skilled lens designers of that era, and whose efforts actually have largely been under-recognized compared to individuals such as Walter Mandler, who was widely recognized as Leica's preeminent lens designer, which Leica released to much acclaim several years after the W-Nikkor was released. Before we get into the details, I wanted to let you know that I'm going to share a wide range of photos that I have taken with this lens over the course of nearly 2 decades on various digital rangefinder cameras, including the Leica M9, the Leica M9 monochrome, the Leica M10R, and the current Leica M10 monochrome. The design of the W-Nikkor 3.5cm f1.8 is particularly remarkable because it represents one of only 2 lenses designed for rangefinder photography using a Xenotar design. The Zenitar design is actually a modified symmetric double Gaussian design, and keep in mind that most of Leica's current lens offerings are made in a double Gaussian design, which is a symmetric lens design that is remarkable for its out-of-focus rendering qualities as well as its limited distortion. Well, the classic Zenitar design comes as 5 elements in 4 groups and is really meant for normal lenses. That particular design was first used and most famously used by Rolleiflex in their 2.8C TLR camera that was produced in 1953. Nikon's formula modified that design, retaining the front 4 elements, but adding a rare earth lanthanum convex rear element. Further, Nikon also added a cemented 2-element doublet rear grouping, effectively producing a lens with 7 elements in 5 lens groupings. Further, the introduction of the lanthanum radioactive element, and yes, this is a radioactive lens, friends. That lanthanum element also is capable of improving the lens's spherical aberration while reducing and limiting lateral chromatic aberration as well as distortion and comma. To top it all off, Azuma's design was able to achieve a very compact form factor for such a fast lens of its time. This is a very compact lens even to this day. The lens features 9 aperture blades and an aperture range of f1.8 to f22. The lens has a 180 degree focus throw as well as a close focus to 0.9 meters. The rendering of the W-Nikkor is something well worth mentioning as part of this review. The lens has a very classic rendering, and what that often means to most is that it has a slightly different, more character-driven, geometric out-of-focus rendering. And while it is sharp, some of the spherical aberration present in the lens's design lends itself to a slight glow, which makes this lens particularly suited for environmental portrait photography, as I'm showing here. Some people would describe the specular highlights of this lens as producing a soap bubble effect. Essentially, the soap bubble bokeh means that the specular highlights are slightly distorted with a rim of brightness around the edge. As I mentioned, the lens is quite sharp at center, and while at f1.8 it has a sharpness fall off towards the edges, it's still entirely acceptable for everyday work. At f4, the lens is critically sharp, so it speaks to how well this lens was designed for an era that dates 70 years before the cameras on which they are mounted were produced. The only other similar lens using a Zenitar design is the much more recently produced Konica UC Hexanon 35mm f2 lens that was released 60 years later and actually does not even perform to the level of optical performance that the W-Nikkor is capable of. Now keep in mind, I keep referring this focal length as 3.5 centimeters instead of 35 millimeters. Well, the convention back in the 1950s and 60s was to use the centimeter scale rather than the millimeter scale. So keep in mind that this is really a 35 millimeter lens. It's a compelling lens based off of its rarity, its optical performance, as well as its rendering. It's really a beautiful lens to shoot with. It combines features of being very, very sharp on center, having a slight bit of spherical aberration that makes it particularly suited for environmental portraiture, as well as rich tones from its single coating that allow it to be particularly well suited to people photography. The fact that only 1,500 copies of this lens were ever made adds to its desirability because of its rarity, and its rich history as being one of the fastest super wide lenses of its era. All of these things make this lens particularly desirable and suitable for collectors and photographers alike. A modern legend in digital and film rangefinder photography. One that's well worth your attention if you ever happen to come upon one of these lenses on the used market. I wouldn't hesitate to try to buy it. Price is not going to be low. I'm going to tell you, you're going to spend quite a bit on this lens, but you're going to be rewarded by a lens that renders uniquely and a lens that's particularly suited to photography of people and black and white photography. It's really a unique combination, and a potent elixir for those of us who are into rangefinder photography. So I hope you find yourself a W-Nikkor. I know it's a rare beast, it's not one that's widely available, but it's certainly one that's worth considering should you happen upon one. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. I'll see you at the next video.